Welcome to the first video. In this video, we'll be creating the blockout for our project. First off, we're going to be creating the blueprints, and for that, I'm using a special script called Blueprint Creator, which I wrote myself. It's pretty self-explanatory, and what it does is save you the work of creating the image planes. You just set a few options, hit a button, and as you can see, the image planes are immediately created. Once that's done, we're going to look at this reference picture, and it shows you the general structure of the bulldozer. These are the shapes we're going to be modeling in the blockout. Now, a blockout really isn't anything complex. You just start off with primitive shapes, such as this box, and I'm choosing a box because naturally the bulldozer is quite boxy, and it's a good idea to start from a similar shape. And once you have this primitive shape, I just start to do some very simple primitive modeling to get the general proportions of the big shapes of the bulldozer down. Now, a blockout is pretty important because the point is you get to know the shapes of the objects you're working on. You look for proportions and you try to identify problems which might arise later on in an early stage. And these problems are mostly proportional problems, like how do these parts fit together, how wide should this be, how high should the ceiling be in relation to the hood of the bulldozer, etc. Once I have this basic part down, I'm creating the symmetry, and logically the bulldozer is mostly symmetrical, though it's not entirely symmetrical, but more on that later. I'm doing a special extrude here. And the reason for that is you'll see right away there's a sort of triangular shape at the side of the hood. Once I move these down, and I'm using Alt X a lot here, which is X-ray mode, then you can see through your mesh and you can see the blueprints. So hotkey is Alt X. That done, just moving these parts around, and now I'm creating a second part, and this part is sort of like the covers that sit above the tracks of the bulldozer. Now I'm creating these as a separate part because this bulldozer is created out of a lot of separate parts in real life, and I want to stick to that and not overcomplicate things by making it one unified mesh. So once again, some simple modeling. I'm subdividing this part and doing a few extrudes on it to get the basic shape out there. And I'm having trouble seeing through my mesh here, so I'm using X-ray mode again. And then I just move these edges around, subdividing things a little bit more to make it easier to work with. And now I'm selecting these parts and extruding them so that I create these slope parts on the bottom of the track covers. Move the verts out. This really isn't difficult, just try and match the blueprints. Not too detailed, just simply trying to get the general proportions right. What I'm going to do now is, this is a pretty important step. The tracks for the bulldozer are, when simplified, one big continuous flowing shape, and of course the best thing to use for that are splines. And this track actually runs across 3 cylindrical wheels, which are then connected by straighter lines. So I'm drawing 3 circles, and then I'm creating separate splines, which are created with the Create Line tool. Now, some parts I can just delete because I don't need them, but as you can see, in some locations, such as here, there are not enough subdivisions to weld these verts together. So I'm using the Refine tool to add more points, and then I can just weld them together. Then I'm deleting the segments that I don't need, positioning the verts on top of each other. Last point there, deleting that segment. Once that's done, I'm just going to select all of them and hit the weld button to weld them together. And there's still some slight tweaking to do to get the general shape of the track down right. And it's important to just keep things flowing and make sure there are no bumps or dents in it. this shape is, again, pretty important because this will be almost the only part of the blockout that we will be using all the way until the end. It will be used for the high poly of the tracks. I'm turning on the spline's renderable options just so that I can see it and that I can have an approximation of the tracks. This is just for spacing and proportions. Giving it some more width, moving it into the correct place. And what I can see now is that it's sitting too close to the body of the bulldozer, so I'm going to have to adjust that a little bit in a moment. First, I'm going to create these wheels here, just some simple quick cylinders. And it always helps to keep your segments down. I mean, there's no point in adding 5 if you're never even going to use those. Using the align tool to get these in position easily. And again, using the align tool and reducing the number of segments. We have that done. I'm just going to change the colors because it's easier to look at like that. I'm going to do the same for the track. These colors don't matter, but I just think it makes sense not to leave them pink and blue and orange. Now I'm going to delete the inside of this mesh because we don't need that, and attach that second part. Now what's up next is we want to create the cabin. You'll probably have noticed by now that the blueprint I'm using is the civilian version of the bulldozer. Now we're creating the military version, and while it's based on the civilian version, the proportions are generally the same. The cabin is the part that differs the most from the civilian version. It's up-armored, completely changed, so we definitely need to stick more to the reference here. Now, I look a lot at reference. We're just not showing it in this video because it just needlessly lengthens things, and we need to keep the video length to a manageable format. So I'm reducing the width of the body here, and this is one of these things why you're creating a blueprint, blockout. If you would have to do this on your high poly model where you have this 10,000 try mesh that's really hard to adjust, you're in for hours and hours of just tweaking and adjusting if you got the proportions wrong. While if you're doing this with a blockout, it's just a 2-second job to do it on a 500 try mesh or something. So I'm subdividing this part at the back a little bit more. Just moving this around, it's not very difficult. Now, I should note that the military version, there's a few different versions for the cabin here. They're not all the same. I'm just choosing one here, but at this moment when I was creating the blockout, I'm not sure which one I'm going to stick to. All that really matters is just to get the proportions down. I mean, you could even see this this blockout as a sort of 3D blueprint. You can also reference it for proportions instead of just your blueprint. Delete the insides, and now we can just weld those together. That's done. I'm gonna weld those to the back over there. Alright, I'm adding a symmetry now, and I'm collapsing it right away because obviously the cabin is not symmetrical. This side is completely different from the right side. The main reason for that is it's a lot wider, it sits a lot more to the side, and there are none of those cargo box-like things on the side. Also, this side has the door for the driver to enter. And you can just see me do the auto smooth there. I prefer to do that because it keeps things easier to look at. It just looks sloppy if you don't have the correct smoothing group set up, even on your blockout. So I'm adding a few more segments here, and the reason for that is there's a sort of window at the back of this cabin, and it sticks out, and I want to create that. Nothing too difficult. So I select these, hit the extrude button, and they have to be flat on the y-axis. There we go. Move these down. Right now I'm selecting the symmetrical parts and I'm just mirroring them to the other side as an instance. Now one thing I'm doing a lot, but we're not showing in this video because it's not all that useful for you guys, is I'm twirling around the model a lot and just looking at the proportions, thinking, does this work? Does this look okay? Should this be moved a little bit to the side? And it's something I recommend that you do as well. Constantly, throughout the whole process of creating this thing, you want to look at it from every angle and just stay critical on yourself and try to judge it. It's very important to spot mistakes and keep the quality up. Next thing I'm doing here is creating the big arm for the blade at the front. This is not very difficult. One thing I'm going to do though is move the pivot so that it's easier to position. It's a lot easier to set the virtual pivots on the real life pivots as well. You can just adjust things a lot easier that way. This is the front blade. Make sure I delete the inside as well. And I'm just going to subdivide the front. Why subdivide the front? Well, the front is actually bent. You can imagine a blade for a dozer is. Doing a little trick, I have a selection. I'm performing a bend on the selection only. Moving the pivot up to change the bend position, and that looks pretty good. That looks like the front blade of a bulldozer. With that done, I'm adding a little subdivision here. So the reason for that is the top is slightly sloped. And then I'm adding a part on the side here. Now, one of the important things you're also creating a blockout is mainly the proportions. Yeah, that's one thing, but also very important is the relation between parts. When you're modeling one part in high detail and you're completely focusing on this part, it's easy to forget that you might have to model another part attached to it, and things might not fit up once you're creating that second part. It's just the same as building something in real life. If you have a window frame and a window, and you're creating one, they might not end up fitting if you don't measure and take precautions. Because we're working virtually, it's a lot easier to keep these things under control. So just keep that in mind. Blockout is also important for the relation between separate parts. We're creating the piston at the top. And again, about this blockout, you should really keep in mind that pretty much every complex mechanical thing, I would recommend starting with a blockout. Something as difficult as this bulldozer, shouldn't even consider starting without it. I mean, it's key to success, and it's also important for your workflow. It keeps things manageable and shows you how much you have left to do. Alright, so we have this big pneumatic part at the top, and what this does, it moves the front blade up and down. And I'm adding some detail to the side here. I'll just remark that it's not really important to add this. You can skip this. As you can see, that's the part I'm creating. Doesn't really matter. And also, these parts differ a lot between versions. So this might change when I create the actual high poly. Another part of the piston on the inside is there's a cylindrical part that slides up and down out of the pneumatic system. The part in purple is actually the armor that protects it from rocket and grenade hits. We're just going to attach these together, change the color, and move it to the correct position. And with that done, I can just rotate it into position and place it correctly. There we go. Now, an interesting part about this bulldozer as well is that another asymmetrical part of it is that on one side of the arms for the front blade, there's a big fat piston that tilts the blade to the front, to the back. On the other side, there are just some metal beams that slide in and out. And I really like the look of this part, so I definitely want to do a good job at this, so I'm adding it into the Blockout. Changing the radius of these parts a little bit. Once again, I'll remark, changing the radius like this is a little bit nitpicky and it's not that important. You can do it just to get a better feel for how things should look. On the one hand, if you pay attention to this sort of stuff, that's a good thing because you'll pay attention to everything in the end. But if you don't want to lose time with this, that's okay too. And one of the final parts we'll be working on is the ripper at the rear. Why is it called a ripper? Well, there's a big shank, which is that bent sort of knife thing, and the shank rips open the ground when it's pulled behind the bulldozer. Sort of a plow. So it's pretty much the most complex mechanical part on the bulldozer. And as you can see, there are a lot of pistons and hinges, and I think this will be the most difficult part to create and get it to fit together. So I definitely need to create a Blockout which has enough thought gone into it. So there's this big main metal part at the bottom. And then there are two sets of two pistons that tilt the ripper and that move it up and down. I'm just adding a symmetry. Apparently it's not positioned correctly, so I'm just going to move the mirror position. Just a remark here, you can notice that I'm always working with my symmetry axis on the X0 position. Then you can just position things correctly with a right click on the 0. I strongly recommend that you do this as well if you don't have that habit yet. It makes things a lot easier to work with. Alright, so I want to save some work, and I'm not going to create a second Blockout piston. I'm just going to copy the one from the front, reset its rotation, and then just move it around and change the proportions a little bit. These proportions aren't very important if there's such slight adjustments, but in general, it doesn't hurt to change them around a little bit. I'm copying it again to use it at the top there. And I'm just making sure that these seem to sit correctly. And then I'm moving this pivot around because obviously it's a lot easier to work with once you've done that. So especially think about later adjustments. If I would want to rotate it, then I want the pivot to be correctly. Here I just copied the newly created parts to the other side. Last part I need to do is the actual shank, just to get an idea of how big it is. It's not that important, but it's easy to create. Duplicating this box. Move that around. And then just perform extrude on it. Now, once again, this might be a little bit too much detail for a Blockout. I could just do with one segment in between here, but so once again, this is just the shape of a part, not that important. It's more about the relation and the proportions. Okay, so with that done, there's one final part in between the tracks and the wheels. There's this pneumatic system that adjusts the position of the front wheel, stretches the tracks. I'm just quickly going to put that in so that we have an idea of how and where the arm is positioned. We're nearly nearing the end of this Blockout. All we have to do is duplicate that to the other side. Once that's done, that's it for this block out.